Good morning and welcome to this webinar on the first ever Solicitors Qualifying Examination results, if I can say that properly, or the SQE. Let's stick to that. That's simpler to say. I hope you're doing better than me. I lost a duel with some playground equipment over the weekend and now have an incredibly sore shoulder. So if you see me wince, it's nothing to do with the content or the SQE results. It is just the losing that duel. But the topics we'll be covering off today include what the results of the assessment showed, how it went operationally, what candidates fed back, some lessons learned, and also some next steps. And to do that, we've got three people. First off, we've got Julie Brannan. She leads on the SQE here at the SRA, the Solicitors Regulation Authority. She's been doing that for almost a decade now, and she was in a great position to do that because previously she worked as a partner in a city law firm and also ran a law school as well. We've then got Jeff Coombe, who's the independent reviewer for the SQE. That is very much what it says on the tin. He is there to review the SQE and provide assurance that it's being implemented effectively. And he'll be talking through how he thinks the SQE one went, what went well, and what could be improved. And then finally, we have a speaker from Kaplan, who's the assessment provider for the SQE. We at the Solicitors Regulation Authority appointed them to deliver the assessment, and they're world-leading experts in professional assessment. And we've got Zoe Robinson to talk through how they think the assessment went, to go into a bit more detail of things, as well as some of those nuts and bolts operational issues. Now, we've already had a good number of questions come in advance, but also you have the opportunity to ask questions live. So if you click on the link below and submit your question, you can do that anonymously, although it's always nice to know your name, and we will try and get through as many of those as possible. Now, I think we advertised this webinar as potentially lasting 90 minutes, and who knows, if we get so many questions, it may do, but actually it may be a bit shorter, but I don't think anyone will mind me giving them a bit of their time and day back. So let's see how effective a chair I am, and let's see if we can get it in under 90 minutes. I also know from looking at who's signed up, we've got training providers, we've got law firms, and we've also got candidates joining us. The content today is very much going to be sort of targeted generally, so it's not at any specific audience, but I would like to give a shout out both for all our SQE webinars on our YouTube channel, which some of them are targeted at certain audiences, so I'd say check that out, but also promote, we've got one on the 8th of March, which is targeted for candidates, and that's around navigating the training market, so keep an eye out for that. So let's move over to Julie. Let's hope this webinar is better than my shirt, and we'll go over to you, Julie, to say how did you think the first SQE1 assessment went?
Thank you very much indeed, Ben, and hello everybody. So if we can move to the first slide in the slide pack, SQE1 November 2021. So this slide really sets the scene. As everybody on the call knows very well, and as Ben has just said, the first assessment ran in November, first ever SQE1. We had over 1,000 candidates, and that included 27 solicitor apprentices and in fact the slide says 100 plus centres around the world. I think we had 139 test centres around the world, so that was quite some organisational challenge. There were two parts to the assessment. Again, I think everybody on this call is likely to know that. There was Functioning Legal Knowledge 1 and Functioning Legal Knowledge 2, which assessed different parts of the curriculum that we require all solicitors to know by the time they are admitted. And candidates needed to pass both parts to pass SQE1. So that sets the scene. That's what was required of candidates, and that's what happened in November. So if we move to the next slide, we set the pass mark by reference to an evaluation of what is required by all solicitors at day one of admission. So we don't have an arbitrary 60, 50, 40% pass mark. It's set, the pass mark is set individually on each assessment to make sure that each assessment is set at exactly the same standard, reflecting that what we expect people to know once they are admitted. And for FLK1, it was set at 57% and FLK2 was set at 56%, which reflects just a sort of slight difference in terms of FLK2 perhaps being on this particular running being slightly more difficult than FLK1, and that's why the pass mark was slightly lower. In fact, what happened was that overall 53% of candidates passed both assessments, but you can see from the slide that more candidates succeeded in passing FLK1 than succeeded in FLK2. And it's quite a striking difference. We've got some thoughts about why that might have happened, and I think we'll come on to talk about that in a bit more detail later on. What I would say at this stage is that this is very early days. This is the first assessment. We don't know whether this pattern will replicate itself in future assessments. Obviously, we'll keep an eye on it. So at this stage, we're not planning making any changes to the composition of the assessments or the timing of the assessments, but we will just be monitoring that just to see how things work out and whether we do need to make any changes in the future. Now, we have had some questions that have come in which have said, well, is this good or bad? Are these results good or bad? What do we think? Was that these pass rates higher or lower than we were expecting? How did it compare with the LPC? And my answer to that is always to remember that this is a standards game, not a numbers game. We never had any quota in mind of the numbers that we expected to pass. Everybody who meets the required standard will pass the SQE. So that's what it's about. It's about making sure that everybody who has demonstrated that they have the knowledge required for day one, practice as a day one solicitor, gets through. In fact, this pass rate is a little bit lower than the pass rate on the LPC, and we have to bear in mind that this is only SQE1. There is another hurdle, which is SQE2. The LPC is, of course, set at a lower standard than the SQE1 because SQE1 is day one admission standard, whereas the LPC is set at day one trainee standard. So they are not quite exact comparisons. And of course, this was a relatively small cohort. It's something I'll come on to say at the moment, in a moment. It's a relatively small cohort. It didn't necessarily reflect a total annual cohort that in due course we will see coming through SQE, because we still have lots of people qualifying through the LPC route. So that's where we are with pass mark and pass rate. So moving on to the next slide. This slide looks at diversity. So as you would expect, we've carefully analysed performance on the SQE by different personal characteristics. What we found was no material difference in performance by gender, disability or social background. But we've been very, very upfront that we did find a troubling attainment gap by ethnicity. That is not what we would have wished to see. It did not come as a surprise to us because it is the pattern that was reflected in the SQE pilots, and also which is a long-standing issue in relation to the LPC. So it wasn't a surprise, but it's not what we would have wished to see. Just in terms of understanding the data on this, it's important to bear in mind that our data is not complete. So as the slide says, 60% of candidates did not fully complete the EDI questionnaire. So one really important lesson learned for us from this is to go and have a look at what we can do to encourage all candidates to fully complete the EDI questionnaire so we can monitor this really accurately and understand the data that we are seeing. Moving on to the next slide, The other point about this is the point I made a moment ago, that this is just data from a single setting, and it represents about 10% of the anticipated future annual cohort numbers. So we had, as I said at the start, 1,000 candidates, but we expect to see in due course perhaps 10,000 candidates coming through the SQE each year. So that's a snapshot of what happened in one exam, but it's important not to overinterpret or extrapolate too much from what happened in a single exam. Nevertheless, we've looked really carefully at this, and we're continuing to worry away at it. We have looked carefully to see whether there's any evidence of bias in the assessment, and we have not found anything, but we will continue to worry away at that and look at that carefully as we go through our quality assurance work. And I think we will return to that in a bit more detail to give you a bit more insight in terms of what we have done there. We have also commissioned the University of Exeter to look at what the wider causes might be of the attainment gap in professional legal education. So that's really going back to look at candidates' journey through the school system. It's looking at what light is shed on this by research which has been happened to see how children progress through school, what happens at nursery school, what happens at primary school, secondary school, university, what happens in other professional regulated exams and so on. So we will look at all of that and see whether that sheds light on the phenomenon that we are observing, but also whether there are any lessons that we can learn about how to address it. So that's where we are in relation to diversity. Moving on to the next slide, we've also monitored very carefully the practical aspects of the SQE. Kaplan administered a candidate survey for all candidates to pick up their feedback on how things went, and from that we are aware that there were in some cases some issues in terms of the candidate experience at the Pearson VUE test centres. I think at this stage what I'd like to say is that for the vast majority of candidates, things went smoothly. I've already said that we had 139 test centres around the world. So in many test centres, things went exactly as you would expect, but we are aware that that was not absolutely universal. So we are following that up to try and make sure that where things were not as good as we would like them to have been, we can improve matters. And again, this is something that we'll come back to in a moment. There was also some hours delay in getting the results out on the 20th of January. We had said to candidates that we would get all results out by 3 o'clock on the 20th of January. And in fact, there were issues in terms of the numbers of candidates who were trying to get access to the site at the same time. And so there was a delay, and we got the results out by 9 o'clock in all except a very, very small number of cases. So for the vast majority of candidates, they got their results on the day that we said they would get it, but there was some delay of some hours in getting that information through to them. And then what we've also done is we introduced a queuing system. This is actually for the SQE2 booking, which we did not have for the SQE1 booking. So when we opened SQE2 booking, I think at the beginning of February, there was a queuing system, which was a new system that we introduced this time round, and that did work effectively at handling that queue, the backlog of people wanting to book for their SQE2. I think we did have at one point on the first day a bit of a wait time for candidates wanting to come through, but the queuing system did its job, and it did mean that all candidates did move through fairly in the order in which they had first tried to access the system. So we introduced that this time round. Moving on then, I wanted to say a word about pass rates by provider. And again, this is a question that we've seen coming through. We were very clear when we were developing SQE that we would be publishing pass rates by provider, and that remains our position. As the slide says, what we will do is we will publish pass rates by the end of 2023. And the reason for taking a little bit of time to do that and not doing so at this point is because we want to make sure that the information that we put out is as accurate and complete as it should be. And we also want to reflect the fact that this first sitting is not necessarily a representative sitting. It's one data set as opposed to a series of data sets that we will have available to us by the end of 2023, when people will be able to see patterns and trends over a period of time. So I think that's really important. Again, we did not all candidates identified their training provider. Not all candidates identified their training provider correctly. So some candidates told us that their training provider was somebody who we know doesn't actually offer SQE training. So it's for all of those reasons, because we're not sure that we captured a completely accurate and complete set of data this time round, that we've decided to just take a bit of time to see how we can improve the data capture systems, our candidate questionnaires, so that the information is accurate and complete when we go out with it at the back end of 2023. However, we do recognise that it is important, where we have sufficient numbers, for training providers to know how the candidates they prepared fared on the SQE. So we have fed back on a confidential basis to those providers with the largest candidate numbers, so they can evaluate their training. In many cases, training providers had very small numbers. That was another reason actually why the data would not necessarily have been terribly accurate. And so even as I say, the slide says, we've only fed back to training providers where we think that they had sufficiently large numbers for the feedback actually be helpful and meaningful to them. So that's pass rate by provider. So moving on to the conclusions. I've put here on this slide a quote from Jeff Coombe, who is our SQE independent reviewer, who I'll be passing on to at the moment. And I think the importance of this is that what we had in November was an exam which was valid, fair, reliable and defensible. So it worked extremely well in terms of the internal stats, which show us that it was able accurately to differentiate between the candidates who had met the required standard and those who hadn't. And so that was a very important conclusion from Jeff in terms of overall how the assessment went. So at that point, I will pass on to Jeff, so you can hear, if you like, direct from the horse's mouth about what he observed in his work as independent reviewer.
Thank you, Julie. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name's Jeff Coombe. I'm going to just very quickly talk you through my background and role, how I conduct my review, and some of my high-level conclusions from my review of the SQE1 first sitting in November 2021. So just to give you a bit of a background in terms of my role itself, it's a part-time role. I observe and review the key stages and activities during the life cycle of the SQE exam process. And I've been doing this role for about 3 years. I do this amongst other activities that I do, and I've got over 25 years experience of working in a range of examination and assessment contexts on both the regulation side and on the exam delivery side. So my specific role on this occasion is that I provide external assurance to the SRA and their exam services provider Kaplan that the SQE will deliver outcomes that are fair, defensible, and will command public confidence. So what I'd like to do in the next slide is to reflect on how I go about my work briefly and how I source the information and evidence to draw my conclusions. So I observe key activities such as the training meetings that take place for the question writers. I review documented processes, policies, and training materials. I sometimes comment on drafts of those. I interview key staff at CAPLAN and at the SRA throughout the life cycle. So I did that as we built up to the SQE1 exams while the delivery was taking place and during the post-exam review process. I observed candidates firsthand sitting the exams at one of the regional assessment centres. I received and reviewed the summary management information that's used by CAPLAN and the SRA to inform their decision making during the exam delivery process that they use to monitor the progress that takes place. And I also received documents such as the post-exam survey results that CAPLAN completed. I also received and reviewed other key documents such as the lessons learnt log that the SRA and the CAPLAN put together and the associated actions that are being drawn up to deal with those lessons learnt. So let me turn to my conclusions, my high-level conclusions in the next slide. Now, overall, my conclusion is that this exam should lead to outcomes that are valid, fair, reliable, and defensible. And it's worth remembering that these exams come after 6 years of planning, 2 years of piloting, and they have been approved by the Legal Services Board. So it's actually a considerable success to introduce a brand new qualification on a national level in this way. And the first live SQE1 exams did have a few operational issues, and those have been touched on already, but actually they did deliver some very good assessment outcomes, and that is no mean feat to do first time. So in terms of the specifics of my high-level conclusions, I observed significant evidence of good practice in each stage of the delivery of the SQE1 exams. And CAPLAN and the SRA showed good attention to detail when they were carrying out lessons learnt. And I've got confidence that the relatively few, but important, mainly operational issues will lead to further improvements in the next SQE1 sitting. So if we turn to the next slide. Both the process for determining the pass boundaries for the SQE1 exam and the psychometric or technical evidence was carefully considered and effective. So for example, there was good evidence that the two parts of the SQE1 exam were reliable, and good use was used of the psychometric expertise available within CAPLAN, and that was verified by the independent psychometrician that is employed by the SRA. On the next slide, I'd like to talk about the differences that we saw in the SQE1 exam outcomes. Now, Julie's touched upon those. There are some differences. Primarily, we saw that white candidates tended to achieve higher pass rates than other ethnic groups. Now, that outcome received particular attention when reviewing the exam, and that review included any individual questions where the difference in performance by ethnic group was notable. And that review was carried out both within CAPLAN and by a subject matter expert employed by the SRA. Now, I observed safeguards have been put in place throughout the life cycle of the exam, and that included training provided to the question writers as to the risks of unconscious bias by ensuring that questions are written to be as precise and as simple as possible. And for example, the language used in questions should not have any unnecessary complexity and should avoid cultural, gender, religious, and ethnic bias or stereotypes. I also noted that the judges that were employed by CAPLAN to review the SQE1 questions and assess the relative difficulty of each question prior to the exam at what's called the Angoff meeting, showed good diversity as well as all being practicing solicitors. So in addition to having diverse ethnic backgrounds, that group of solicitor judges were also representative of the wider community in that they had newly qualified solicitors represented and solicitors who had experience of working with newly qualified solicitors. Now, it's also important to remember that any exam outcome is a snapshot of attainment of that candidate at a point in time. Each candidate will have received different levels of support and resources. They will have access to different levels of training, and they will have received different opportunity throughout their lives in the build up to that exam taking place. Now, whilst I am satisfied that all reasonable steps have been taken to avoid any form of bias or unfairness, I have recommended that CAPLAN and the SRA keep investigating the issue of differential ethnic performance. And they can do this partly by unlocking the newfound power of the new large-scale data set that will be built up over the next few years that summarises the performance of candidates on each question and candidate outcomes overall by different demographic groups. And the aim should be to continue exploring and seeking better understanding of new ideas to reduce significant outcome differences by any demographic. And we know, as Julie's mentioned, that work is already planned in a wider context with Exeter University. Now, that should be done while continuing to build a team that are responsible for producing, editing and reviewing questions who are representative of the wider community, and while maintaining focus on this issue as the preparations for the first live SQE2 exams are finalised. And of course, that introduces human marking for the first time too. But I want to summarise and leave you with my final conclusion, which is I want to stress overall that the first SQE1 exam appears by any measure to have been a success, and the outcomes stand up well to comparison with any other professional exams leading to a licence to practice in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. That was really interesting to have that run through. But perhaps before we jump into a conversation now with Zoe to get sort of Kaplan's take on how it went, Julie, I wonder whether we've had a couple of questions come in. I could just quickly run those past you. They're both sort of about training, actually. So the first one's from Stephanie, and she's asked, how did candidates perform who didn't enrol on study courses? And she's also sort of followed up and said, are you in a better position to not do a course if you've done a law degree? And I think this person seems particularly concerned about the cost of courses. So a few things in there. What would you have to say to Stephanie?
Yeah, what I would say is that the SQE assesses a huge amount of material. The curriculum is equivalent to the compulsory subjects on a law degree or on a GDL, and also the subjects studied on the LPC. So if you think that vast amount of information that we require candidates to know and be able to use and apply in the sort of scenarios that a newly qualified solicitor might encounter in practice. So whether you acquire that knowledge through a formal course or through self-study, I think it's really important for people to recognise that there is a lot here that has to be learned. And I think that it's important for people to be realistic with themselves about how they study, their ability, how they are best likely to be able to succeed in the exam. We do know that there are textbooks that are being produced, so people can do this through self-study. What I would suggest is that you probably need to have some sort of check through multiple choice questions or whatever it is to make sure that you have correctly understood and are able to apply the content of those textbooks so that you're putting yourself in a good position to pass. So Whether you decide to buy a formal training course, whether you decide to do formal face-to-face teaching or an online course, or whether you do it by self-study, there is something that that is required. We do track, the difference between self-study and formal courses, but the numbers are really so small at the moment that I just think it would not at this stage be very helpful or give a very accurate impression about how people performed. And we're talking handfuls of people, and that will clearly depend on the particular talents and abilities of the people who decided to self-study as opposed to the people who decided to buy training courses. In terms of the cost of training courses, they are very variable. So do your homework, have a look around and see what are the more expensive courses, what are the less expensive training courses. There is training which is substantially cheaper than the cost of the LPC, so do have a look at that. There is more opportunity through the SQE to earn while you learn, so you can do online courses that you fund through working, be that working in some non-related, non-legal related job, or actually in a law firm or doing some legal work. And many, even the private training providers have got loan schemes where you can get funding to pay for tuition. So there is some funding available and some means through to pay for this.
Thank you, Julie. And just one more question before we chat to Zoe. We've had a question from Carol, who's asked, is there any comparison of how people performed, whether they took an online course or an in-person prep course? Have we got any data to show what the difference is there?
No, we don't. We have not asked that question. So we've asked candidates to identify their training provider, but we don't necessarily know what form of training they took at their training provider. And I suspect some training providers offer different forms of training, because they're trying to cater for candidates who choose different ways to learn in different ways. But I think it is quite an interesting insight. It's certainly something that we might want to think about in terms of going forward. It does give us insight into different training methods and its effectiveness. On the other hand, I guess we have to weigh that against the fact that we already ask an awful lot of questions of candidates, and do we want to make that the candidate questionnaire even longer to complete? But it's certainly something for us to think about. So thanks for raising that.
Thanks, Julian. We've got a lot of questions coming in. I see there's quite a few questions on standard setting being one of the topics. And I think that will be something, hopefully, perhaps Zoe and Julie, you could pick up in your conversation. But I think, Julie, I'll hand back over to you because I think you're going to have a chat with Zoe around how sort of the detail from how things went from a Kaplan perspective, and also picking up some of those questions we've had in advance, but also we're getting in now. So keep those questions coming. Thank you. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben, and hello to Zoe. So I was just wondering whether you want to take a moment to introduce yourself before we pick up some of the some questions that I have for you.
Yeah, of course. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you. As Ben introduced, my name's Zoe Robinson, and I'm a Director of Qualifications at Kaplan. So working very closely with Julie and her team on the implementation of the SQE.
So Zoe, people have heard my views about how the SQE went and views from Jeff. I guess first question is really, how do you think from Kaplan's point of view as assessment provider SQE1 went?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And as we've acknowledged so far, but both yourself and Jeff, obviously the first delivery of SQE, so a monumentous event, 26 countries, 139 test centres, in what turned out to be quite challenging COVID times at that point as well. I think, as we were going in the plan up, we'd all hoped that everything would have kind of calmed down a little bit by November, but it turned out to be the opposite with all the Omicron variant. But overall, we're really happy with how it went. I think one of the most important aspects for us, as Jeff touched on, is the quality of the assessment. So whether the exam was fair, valid, reliable, etc. And our comprehensive post-test analysis, the psychometric analysis, has shown some excellent statistics in those areas, which is largely an outcome and a reflection of the incredible amount of work that went into the overall development of the test, the design of the test, as well as how it was delivered. I think many of the statistical trends that we did see were what we were expecting to see. So, for example, candidates who had higher degree classifications tended to do better on the SQE. So that's largely as we would have expected. We had a reasonable number of candidates that sat with reasonable adjustments as well. So I think we had 76 candidates in total across a whole range of different adjustments. So things like additional time, additional breaks, being permitted to bring medication into the assessment, having their own assessment room, some use of assistive technology as well. So a nice broad range of different adjustments. And what I was particularly pleased to see was that the results that we saw from those candidates were entirely in line with the overall pass rates that we saw for the whole candidate population. So that gives a lot of comfort that our equality and quality team, who work with the candidates to get those adjustments in place, have made appropriate adjustments for those candidates that requested them. Obviously, there's some things that we want to improve on. Both you and Jeff made reference to some of the operational side of things, and I'm sure we'll touch on those later on. You'll have some more questions on those. Importantly, we do a lot of gathering of feedback. Jeff's mentioned the lessons learnt log that we keep, and this is the first delivery, but we will use that feedback and work on those lessons to ensure that we can keep improving.
Yeah, I think I do want to ask you about some of the operational matters that I referred to a moment ago as well. But just for now, can you pick up on this point about the release of the assessment results? I mentioned earlier on that we were expecting them to be out by 3 o'clock on the 20th of January, and actually we didn't get them out until 9 o'clock or 9:30, I think. Can you just expand on what happened there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, unfortunately, there was a delay due to a technical issue on the results platform, but we worked incredibly hard from the moment we discovered the issue, and as a result, we did manage to get them released later on in that day, as you said. We're obviously really sorry for that delay. We understand that candidates were sort of geared up for getting the results, and that did cause additional stress for them. So we are very sorry about that. We have already reviewed in detail what happened, and work's already underway to reduce the risk of those issues in happening in future sittings. And I'd just really like to thank candidates for their patience and understanding. We got some lovely messages through to the candidate services team as we were going through that, thanking for us for the ongoing work to get those results out later on that day. So that was really nice to get that support.
Well, that's good to hear, and also that actually, the work is underway to minimise the risk of this happening again. I mean, I think that's important for candidates to hear. Moving on then to a different topic, I wanted to discuss with you the pass rate and the pass mark. And as Ben said, we've had quite a few questions that have been raised about how the pass mark is set, because that's new for us in this sector. That on the LPC we've always had a pass mark of 50%, and this time we have a mechanism to have a consistent standard, but sometimes that means that the actual pass mark on exams will move around a bit. Can you explain to everybody how the pass mark is reached?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think there's probably a couple of different areas here. So I'll tackle the pass mark and how that's reached first, and then I'll perhaps come back and have a look at some of the more detailed statistics. So, I mean, we're very confident that the pass rates were appropriately and objectively set. Jeff made reference to the ANGOF panel standard setting process. And this is how the pass mark is determined. So it involves a panel of solicitor judges, I think was the term that Jeff used, and it's a good term to use. So all qualified solicitors from a diverse range of backgrounds, both in terms of ethnicity, gender, disability, but importantly, a diverse range of experience within the profession as well. And what this panel do is they look at the questions on the exam, and for each question, they judge that against the day one newly qualified solicitor standard. The point you made about the difference between LPC and SQE there. So it is that day one newly qualified standard. They look at the questions and they determine how many or what percentage, what proportion of candidates they think would answer that question correctly. And that's the process that we go through, and that is what drives the standard setting and ultimately the pass mark that is set. Academically, the assessment worked really well. We're happy that the question design and that standard is therefore appropriate. So yes, there were some observed differences. If we can just pull up the slide looking at the statistics, this is an extract from the statistical report that we released alongside the results. And what you can see there is that, as we've said, the pass marks were quite similar, 57% on FLK1, 56% on FLK2. But the pass rate for FLK2 was much lower, suggesting that candidates did find that to be the harder paper of the two. Overall, the pass rate was 53%. So that's the 53% of candidates got through both of those assessments. And so given the pass rate for each of the individual elements, we can conclude that the majority of people who got through FLK2 also got through FLK1 and therefore passed overall. Importantly, and what isn't on this slide, but was something that we looked at as all of the post-assessment analysis, there was a very strong and statistically significant positive correlation between the scores achieved by the candidates who sat both papers. So that's to say that a candidate score for those who sat both assessments were highly aligned with each other. So those doing well on one paper were also likely to do well on the other, and those that didn't do well did badly on both. So that is a really important factor and gives us a lot of confidence again about the overall outcomes. When you start to break it down a little bit, so the table at the bottom of this slide, we can see that the mean or the average scores support the difference in difficulty that we've seen. So the average score on FLK2 at 57% was lower than FLK1 at 51%. But what's quite interesting is that there's a quite similar minimums, maximums, and the range, so the difference between that minimum and maximum. So that was actually quite similar between the two exams. So it was actually the middle of those score ranges where we were seeing the main differences, with FLK2 being consistently lower by a few percent. All the statistical analysis that we've done, there's no obvious single reason why candidates generally did better on FLK1 than FLK2. We've done a thorough review of the questions that appeared in each of them. None of that suggested that there was anything within the question design or the standards to drive that difference in performance. Of course, we will keep monitoring this as we go through and complete future sittings. What we did observe, though, was some differences in performance in practice areas. Now, we can only speculate about candidates' preparation in those areas. So any conclusions from that would just be pure speculation. And in line with Jeff's findings, as he said, we're not planning on making any changes to the assessment design at this early stage. We need to keep monitoring it and see how these trends might build up or not as we go through time.
So just pausing on that point, Zoe, as you say, we are speculating at this point, but do you have any thoughts really why hypotheses why candidates might have performed less well on FLK2 than FLK1?
If I pull up the next slide, which is again an extract from the statistical report, looking at the performance by practice area. So I mentioned that there were some differences that we observed in those practice areas, and these charts show how candidates performed by reference to quintiles. So quintiles calculated by basically dividing the candidate pool into 5 equal groups based on their performance. So each quintile shows the range of scores achieved by a fifth of the candidates. So quintile 1 shows the top fifth down to quintile 5 showing the bottom fifth of scores. So if we take a step back and look at what these show us. So on FLK1, all subject areas performed pretty well. We could see a slightly higher performance maybe on contract law. Ethics did a little bit better as well when compared to the other areas, but broadly most of those areas performed well. When we get to FLK2, most subject areas performed well. So in particular, we could pull out the principles of criminal liability and again, ethics, both scored quite highly when compared to other areas. But we can equally see a couple of areas that didn't perform as well. So specifically property practice and criminal law and practice were 2 areas where candidates scored slightly lower. And one observation, again, a little bit speculation, so we have to be careful, but one observation is that it does seem to be those practice or more practical application areas of the syllabus, the ones perhaps that were more historically covered within the LPC, where candidates may not have performed as well. So, for example, on criminal liability, they've done much better than on criminal law and practice. Related areas, but one very much the sort of knowledge, black letter law, and one the more practical application. Same would be true for the land law versus property practice. Now, as there are more of these practice areas in the FLK2 syllabus, that may be an explanation for where we're seeing the relative performance of the 2 assessments. It's not actually really an FLK1, FLK2, it's the content of the syllabus areas and having that slightly greater focus on those practical application areas. As I say, pure speculation, and it may be that there's many other explanations for it, but that's an initial observation that's maybe worthwhile sharing.
So interesting, and perhaps something for training providers to sort of put in their pot and think about.
Yeah.
I do think we do need to be really quite cautious about jumping to conclusions based on
Absolutely.
a single sitting, but it would be interesting to just to reflect on that, and obviously we will monitor whether we see the same patterns in successive sittings of the SQE. But I guess the critical thing there that I take from what you've said, Zoe, is that overall that the stats show that the standard was accurately and properly set, that those pass marks were properly reflect that standard across each of those 2 exams. Yeah. Can we move on then to something else that I also touched on in my opening remarks? I did mention the differences in the performance of candidates from different ethnic backgrounds, and the research we've commissioned from Exeter University to carry that out. And I said there that we had not identified any evidence of bias from the monitoring and the work that we have done internally in the exam and the quality assurance processes around the exam. And I thought it would be helpful if you were able perhaps to talk to everybody, expand on what those quality assurance processes are. What are the checks and the steps that we have taken to avoid any risk of bias, and then to check that we're not seeing any evidence of bias come through in our checks and statistics?
Yeah, sure, no problem. There's lots of things that we're doing. Jeff's made reference to a few of them as well. So let's maybe start with the questions in the assessments. So the first thing to say is that all question writers, but whether this is SQE1 or SQE2, obviously receive training on how to write good quality questions, and part of that training includes diversity and inclusion training, how to avoid unconscious bias within questions. Jeff referenced things like, avoiding superfluous information, making sure that there's not information there that could be viewed as being causing a difference for anything from ethnicity, gender, disability, etc. The questions themselves go through a comprehensive process of editing and review, and then a sample of those questions are also independently reviewed by the SRA's appointed external independent subject matter experts. And in addition, for SQE1, we've talked a bit about the ANGOF panel. So all of the questions are seen by ANGOF panel members as well, which, as I've previously mentioned, was a diverse panel, both in terms of ethnicity as well as disability and experience in the profession. So that kind of all happens pre-assessment. Post-assessment, we do a very detailed statistical analysis at item level. Again, Jeff made reference to this. So we look at, for each question, how that question performed against various different protected characteristics, and any question where we see any evidence of differential performance on that is reviewed in light of that. We do actually look at all of the questions after the assessment. It isn't just those ones that get highlighted, but we use the statistics to direct and our focus, to sort of put a lens on the focus that we're giving. Interestingly, on SQE1 this time, of the questions that we identified that had a differential attainment, there was about an equal split between the number where white candidates performed better versus ones where candidates from an ethnic minority performed better. So that was quite reassuring to see in and of itself, in a way. But yeah, all of those questions are reviewed, and just to reaffirm here, no issues were identified on any of those reviews. That was also an internal CAP plan review, and as Jeff mentioned, an external independent review by one of your subject matter experts. It's possibly worthwhile, I mean, this might be stating the bleeding obvious, so apologies, but SQE1 is a multiple choice test. So, there's no potential bias in the marking for SQE1. It's all marked via the computer. But of course, for SQE2, that is going to be different. So as a quick reminder, I'm sure people on this call don't necessarily need this, but just in case, SQE2 is going to be made up of two different parts. We've got a written element, which will be marked by a team of qualified solicitors. That marking is all going to be done anonymously. Candidates will have a candidate number assigned to them, and the markers will not see anything to do with the candidate's identity when they are conducting that marking. But we've also got the oral element of SQE2, and clearly that isn't going to be the case there. You can't do that anonymously. That is a face-to-face assessment that takes place there. So ahead of those exams, very much our focus is on the recruitment and training of the markers and assessors. So when recruiting markers and assessors, and indeed the same was true when we recruited question writers as well, our focus has been on trying to attract examiners from as diverse a range of backgrounds as we can. We've been trying to do that with our recruitment campaigns, enlisting the help of a range of organisations that represent solicitors from different diverse backgrounds, be that ethnicity or disability, etc. As with the question writers, again, all assessors and markers are getting trained. We've commissioned specialist external training on diversity and inclusion with a specific focus on the role that they will be carrying out. So, for example, making sure that our examiners understand the assessment criteria as part of that training, and that the criteria where there's a sort of scope for latitude to recognise that there will be some variances, for example, in communication, maybe due to cultural divergences or even regional communication differences. You know, as you can tell, proud Yorkshireman here. So yeah, there's different dialects, different things that are said around, and so it's important that our assessors and our markers understand exactly what the minimum criteria is that everybody needs to be able to show, and where there can be that sort of latitude. So I'm thinking specifically here, we've got assessment criteria for the advocacy assessment that's about appropriate language and behaviour, or for interviewing, communicating and explaining in a way that is suitable for the client to understand. All these particular criteria, we need to be able to, as objectively as possible, allow our markers and assessors to be able to grade that. Finally, again, all of that sort of pre-exam, we will be doing a lot of post-exam analysis as well for SQE2. We can monitor the examiners live for the assessors, so we can do live observations on them. We've got live access into the marking platform, so we can see how markers are performing as we are in progress with the marking. We'll be doing detailed statistical analysis, so looking at performance by marker assessor for various protected characteristics, and feeding back to markers as well on their performance as they go through. So lots of different things that we are doing to ensure that ultimately the exam, we're confident to be able to say that is free from bias.
Yeah, so really important. Thank you very much. So that was really full and careful answer, and I hope people recognise that the extent of the work which is undertaken around this, and that we will continue to focus on it. It's critically important. This is a fair assessment, of course, and we will continue to monitor it and to publish these sorts of stats after each exam, so people can see trends over time and what is happening. And that goes back to Jeff's point about using the power of the stats that come out of the SQE to shine a light on this problem, which is very much our intention. Yeah. So can I move on to asking you about the feedback? So I think you mentioned that you did a candidate survey, and I wondered whether you could share with people what some of the key themes that you have seen from that feedback.
Yeah, of course. So after each assessment, we'll do a thorough review of all aspects of the assessment. I've obviously talked a lot about the statistics, and people will be fed up with me saying the word statistics now. But we gather an awful lot of feedback. So the candidate survey is a main part of that. And off the back of that survey, we've also done quite a bit of more individual or group communication with candidates. So every candidate that gave negative feedback and indicated that they were happy to discuss that with us, we contacted them to have a more qualitative discussion with them about their feedback. And then we've also held 3 separate candidate focus groups, 2 quite general ones, and then 1 specifically focused on reasonable adjustments. And they enabled us to hear firsthand from candidates and again get that more qualitative, detailed insight back from them. We've also had feedback sessions with our staff, all of our own checks, feedback sessions with Pearson VUE as our test centre provider, with the SRA team and particularly the SRA's quality assurance team, and with Jeff as well, in his position as independent assessor. So all of this has given us a really vast amount of insight to be able to go away and identify primarily areas where we want to improve. That's often your focus with feedback, isn't it? But we've also had some really good positive feedback as well, so we shouldn't ignore that. We've had some great feedback on the website, the booking and registration journey, particular praise for our candidate services team, which has been really nice to hear. Possibly for the sake of me not talking for hours on this, which I obviously could do, I'm going to distill it down into, I think, 3 main areas that we've had feedback from candidates in particular on. You mentioned initially, Julie, in your opening slides about operational issues and sort of things in the test centres. So yes, we did hear back some reports of noise at some of the test centres. And perhaps some inconsistencies in approach. So, for example, some test centres offered earplugs. Others, that offer wasn't volunteered. Sometimes candidates asked for them, or if they didn't know that they were available, they didn't know to ask for them. We had some delays in starting in some test centres as well for various reasons. And by getting the sort of level of detail of feedback that we've been able to get from candidates, that's been great because it allows us to sort of dig a little bit deeper, investigate these issues and give feedback back to Pearson VUE, so we're better able to understand what happened and in particular what changes can be made for future sittings. So that process is already well underway and we're very advanced in those discussions, so that when we get to the SQE2 exams, the written elements that again will be held in Pearson VUE test centres, that hopefully we're going to see some improvements in those areas, which would be good. Second area, sort of broad theme, would be around the questions. So I think we've got 2 main aspects here. We've got feedback relative to the sample questions. So perhaps candidates thinking that the sample questions weren't representative fully of the questions in the assessment, and also some elements of feedback about the questions in the assessment, maybe sort of being longer or even containing some inaccuracies. We don't believe that is the case. As we've said, we've done a detailed review of all questions, not just ones that may have shown evidence of differential performance. And that didn't raise any issues. The statistics would clearly identify if there was a problem with a question. So we don't believe that there were any fundamental issues with those questions. It's perhaps worth highlighting the process of producing questions a little bit more here. So I've mentioned the training quite extensively already. That does incorporate training around the difficulty of the questions, and emphasising that we need to pose the challenge to the questions about whether they can apply their legal knowledge. This is ultimately an exam that moves you towards a professional qualification. You get a license to practice as a solicitor. These multiple choice tests are never going to be just a reiteration and spewing of basic knowledge. It's not a learn and churn type thing. It is always focused on applying that legal knowledge. And that training is delivered to our question writers to ensure that is the case. All of our question writers are solicitors. We then have dedicated employed subject heads that are experts in a particular practice area, and they have responsibility for reviewing and working with the question writers to edit those questions through an iterative process. I've mentioned the review, the sample review that's done by your subject matter experts as well, and again the ANGOF panel. So there's a lot of steps that go into the overall production of these questions. The point about the sample questions, so the sample questions were originally selected to give a good illustration of the sort of the range of different question lengths and areas that are going to be covered. They were extracted from a much larger pool of questions, which forms our question bank, out of which we will select questions for the assessments. And all of those questions have been through the exact same process in terms of production. I think it's also worthwhile just emphasising that the sample questions, they are just that, they are a sample. They won't represent all of the material or every possible area that's going to come up in SQE1. They're not a mock exam, importantly, and I think it's important that candidates don't try to view those sample questions as a mock exam. I might as well just take the opportunity, because I know we've had a number of questions on this. We don't have any plans at this point to be publishing any more sample questions. That isn't to say that we won't over time. I'm sure we will, but at this stage, we won't be publishing any more sample questions.
But obviously, though, you keep them under review and
Of
update
course.
them and so on.
Of course we do, yes, absolutely. And then the third point, the third sort of area I was going to cover was reasonable adjustments. So we had some feedback from candidates that the time that was being taken between agreeing what the adjustment was going to be for the candidate and then actually getting them formally booked in to the Pearson Centre, for this particular centre with this particular adjustment, and getting that confirmation through was taking too long. And we've already taken some steps to amend our processes on this, so that's moving much faster for our SQE2 candidates that are currently booking. We also had some feedback about the messaging to candidates in advance, be that on the process and the responsibility of the parties involved, the candidate, our reasonable adjustment liaison officers, and also the being a bit clearer and a bit more detailed on the exact nature of the agreement, the adjustment that was being agreed. So, for example, if we agree an adjustment for a sole use room, what does that actually mean in terms of, will the door need to be open or not? May there be people walking past? Will the walls be glass walls or solid walls? Those sorts of things that can make a difference to candidates depending on their specific condition. So again, we've already put new steps in place to ensure that candidates get that clarity, and there's a more detailed dialogue that's going on between the candidate and their main liaison person to ensure that we get those adjustments exactly as candidates need them. As ever, we'll continue to engage with various groups representing solicitors with various different disabled backgrounds to inform our work on this area.
So you started moving on then to just picking up some of the enhancements and changes that you're putting in place for future sittings. Is there anything else that you want to highlight in terms of what you might be changing for the next SQE sitting?
Yeah, I mean, one that's already gone through that's worthwhile noting, just in case anybody's missed it, is following feedback from stakeholders more generally. We've updated on our website information about the cut-off date for the law upon which candidates will be examined in the assessments. So we had feedback from some candidates saying that it going right up to the date of the assessment was making it very difficult for them to prepare. Similar feedback from training providers as well. So we've now set that cut-off date as being 4 calendar months prior to the date of the first assessment in that window. So that will help to clarify that position. The assessment specifications have been updated to reflect that as well. We had quite a large number of well, I say large number relative to other points. We had a bit of feedback around water. I'm not strictly speaking answering your question here about what we are changing, but it's a useful point at which to get across the message. So there was comments from candidates about having access to water during the assessment. Now we understand that's something that candidates want, but access to water is actually governed by Pearson VUE testing rules primarily, and concerns around the disruption that could be caused having water on desks, which could spill onto the equipment. We want to avoid a situation where spillages could mean that a candidate's work or attempt is lost in any way. So these rules are very commonplace in Pearson VUE centres. But of course, as I say, we understand candidates' concerns, and what we are going to do is update things on the website so it's clearer for candidates about what they will have access to, won't have access to, so they can therefore plan accordingly. Obviously, if access to water during the assessment is required for medical reasons, then candidates can let us know that, and that can be accommodated if we know in advance. And they can access water during the assessment day and during the sort of the scheduled breaks as well, when they can access water in their lockers. So I thought that was worthwhile clarifying. We've also seen some evidence that candidates or indeed training providers who have been advising candidates might be unclear on a couple of aspects in relation to the assessment regulations and some of the associated policies. So we're therefore looking to clarify that position. We'll be making some small amends to the policies to get that clarification and to update the website with that. And I know we're in talks, Julie, about whether we might host a webinar later on in the year to ensure that candidates and providers are better informed on those areas. And then finally, I'll pick up on reasonable adjustments again. I know I mentioned a few things that we were changing, but one really positive thing that came through the feedback was the system that we have in place with having a main liaison person assigned to each candidate who's making a reasonable adjustments application, and who will work with that candidate to understand their medical condition and ensure that right accommodation. That's got some really positive feedback. So we're going to be continuing that approach and enhancing that further as well. But just to reiterate the point we said before, we are happy with the overall way things have run, and in particular the design of the assessment. So we're not planning on making any changes to the assessment itself.
Thanks very much, Zoe. Just to note, we've got about 20 minutes left, and we have had actually really quite a lot of questions come in, which I'd like to get to. So I wanted to pick up with you just a couple of things before we go on to questions from people watching the webinar. Can you talk as briefly as possible about contingency planning for the SQE2? That's quite an important point for people to be aware of. Obviously, where we are at the moment, it's looking as if certainly in the UK, COVID restrictions are falling away. But very briefly, could you just give us some headline points about a contingency planning?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, we obviously continue to keep this under close monitor. If the exams were impacted by and couldn't go ahead, so if they were impacted by the pandemic, the plan would be to move to an online delivery, where exams would be taken over the internet with remote invigilation. This has become a much more common way of doing exams over the past couple of years, obviously. But it still does present a number of challenges, particularly in terms of accessibility and fairness. So our preferred model does still remain the delivery of assessments in the specialist test centres, that face-to-face delivery. So in terms of triggering a contingency, we would look at whether there was a closure of a large number of test centres or of UK borders that was resulting in a widespread difficulty for candidates travelling or accessing test centres. I must really stress that, though, we are talking widespread is the key word. Clearly, we're keeping April at the forefront of our minds, and as you've said, Julie, I think we're hopeful that the contingency will not be needed in the current situation, but we've all learned never to say never as we've gone through this pandemic, haven't we? So
yeah, indeed so. So please do keep an eye on things, watch this space, have a look on any communications that go out on the SQE website. Final point before we go to questions, can you just remind people of next dates, next steps on SQE, and perhaps could you pick up questions about candidates moving from SQE1 to SQE2, because we have had some questions come in about that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so if we just go to the next slide, so SQE2, I think most people are aware of this. So the exams are taking place, written exams on the 11th to the 13th, oral exams. We've actually got 4 different runs of the oral exams now. That's more than we originally were scheduling. We were originally scheduling 2 exams, and that's in response to feedback that we've had about the predicted levels of demand. I think there was a question earlier on about whether all 4 runs would have the same questions on them, and whether they'd have the same pass mark or not. So I might as well pick that one up now. No, there will be different questions. Clearly, that wouldn't be particularly fair if the questions that came up on the first run were then repeated later on. So it will be different tasks that candidates will do on each of the runs, and there will be different pass marks, therefore, for each of the runs that we see. Booking opened on the 31st of January. I won't go through that again. Julie, you mentioned the queuing system and the fairness that brought about, which was good. That booking window closes on the 7th of March, and the results will be out towards the end of August. The exact date will be confirmed on that shortly. Then if we move on to the SQE1, the next sitting in July, 21st and the 25th are the exact dates, and the booking window for that will open on the 17th of March and close on the 16th of June. I think, as you say, Julie, we've had a lot of questions around the ability for candidates to move from this July SQE1 sitting onto the SQE2 sitting that will take place in October. We've always said that it's our aim to set a timetable which will permit candidates to move through the assessments and the overall qualification quickly. But our main focus has to be on the appropriate assessment outcomes, the psychometric analysis that's done, and making sure that those outcomes are fair, valid, reliable as an assessment. So whilst it is our longer term aim and remains our longer term aim for that progression, I'm afraid that will not be possible for the SQE1 in July for candidates to move on to the SQE2 in October. This is the exception. We are confident that by the time we get through to the third delivery, this is the July exam is only our second delivery. So by the time we get onto the third delivery and we're looking at the January SQE1 progressing through to April SQE2, we're confident that that will be possible. But for this second delivery, that progression will not be possible. So it's important that candidates know that ahead of booking the July exam when that booking window opens in March. And so yeah, that's where we're at on the future deliveries.
And I guess one observation on that progression from SQE1 to SQE2 is that I guess some feedback for people is that if you have not already got practical work experience in a legal environment, in a law firm or an in-house legal team, it's really important that you do that. Remember that SQE2 is about practical legal skills, and it is assessed not at the LPC standard, it's assessed at the standard of a day one qualified solicitor. So bear in mind when you're thinking about timing and your progression through from SQE1 to SQE2 that getting some good quality qualifying work experience under your belt before SQE2 is likely to stand you in very good stead. I'm going to hand over to Ben in a very quick moment, but I think I can probably pick up just one or two questions really quickly. We had a question about where the assessment criteria were to be found, and that's they are set out in the assessment specification, which is that was a question from Ian, which is published on the SQE website. So do take a look at that. We had a question which I'm going to quickly pass on to Zoe for a quick fire reply, Zoe, about the size of the ANGOF panel.
Oh, I think it was. I think we had about 18 involved in total, and each individual panel had about 13 members on it, I think.
So that gives people a sense of this. The standard is not set by an individual, it's set by a number of people coming together, as Zoe says.
Yes,
so
right.
There you are, just a couple of points there. I'm going to pass over to Ben now, because you've probably been going through the questions in more detail than I have while I've been talking to Zoe.
Yes, thank you. That was really interesting, and I was slightly distracted by imagining what a Yorkshire version of the SQE would look like. But beyond that, we've had loads of questions, and quite a lot of them you've picked up. But I staked my reputation on finishing this on time. So what we're going to do, we'll do these questions, but we'll do it very much as almost a lot of them can be answered quite quickly. So we'll do as a quick fire round. So Zoe, I think you answered this question talking about not having a plan to publish new sample questions. But I suppose to complete that circle, we've had quite a few questions about, will past exam papers be published?
No, past exam papers will not be published.
That's a nice, simple, short one. We've had a question from Urema, and that she's asked, were both tests, FLK 1 and 2, written by the same team?
Yes, they were. So we have a dedicated team of subject heads that, as I said before, specialise in the practice areas, and we have a team of question writers, again, who specialise in the different practice areas.
And we just had someone check on the Angoff panel, is everyone solicitors on there? And I think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
We've got a question from a paralegal for you, Julie. What can I do if my employer refuses to sign off qualifying work experience without a good reason?
Yep, so we do have a QWE qualifying work experience helpline. So do ring into the SRA and you can talk to somebody about what the circumstances are and how and they can engage with your employer to understand what the problems might be and try to make sure that agreement is reached on the way forward.
Yep, and also if you want to look at some of our webinars on qualifying work experience, you'll get
we've
more
got
about
webinars
what would count or what wouldn't count.
That's right, and also there's guidance on our website, isn't there, Ben, too?
Yes. So next question, we've got a question from Roland and Linda, and they're asking about apprentices and specifically about data on apprentices' performance in the SQE, and also do we have more granular data like graduate apprentices versus other apprentices? It's a bit early for that, isn't it, Julie? In terms
we
of
don't have that. As we said, we had 27 apprentices, so you can see it's relatively small numbers. The pass rate was very high. It was significantly higher for that group of people than for candidates as a whole. But we haven't gone out with the precise numbers just because the overall that group of 27 is quite small numbers. Obviously, the SQE1 was about knowledge, not practical skills. Nevertheless, I think it's quite noticeable that the sort of the immersion and the integrated approach that the apprentices have gone through over really a long period, those people have been on their apprenticeship for 5 or 6 years, it works. It's looking early days, obviously, and for all the things I said earlier, it's important not to overinterpret, but it's looking as though that is an effective way of qualifying as a solicitor, and we were really pleased to see that.
I've got another question from Roland. I presume perhaps it's the same Roland, unless there's several Rolands out there. Zoe, and this is perhaps for you, is there any feedback on the sort of time frame for each session or the timing of taking the exam and how that worked out for candidates? Because there's quite a lot of questions, aren't there?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions. So yes, there is feedback. This is something we looked at very carefully as part of the post-assessment statistical analysis, and it was really pleasing to see that the sort of average time taken was well within the sort of amount of time that is allowed. So that was comforting. We also do look at candidate level as well as at item level to see whether there's any evidence of people running out of time, whether they're sort of rushing through the later questions or anything like that. And we didn't see any sort of substantive or significant evidence of that. So I think we were quite comfortable and pleased with the way the timings had worked out overall.
And then another question for you, Zoe, just coming from Nur. They've asked, are there sufficient spots for SQE2 for anyone who wants to book on it?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned before, we put on some additional oral runs in order to ensure there was sufficient capacity to meet demand. There are still plenty of seats left available across all 4 dates and across all 4 locations on various dates. So yeah, plenty of seats there, Nia.
Thank you. Question for you, Julie. Someone's asked about the cut-off date for an SQE pass being valid this 6-year period, and they've asked, is it from the date you passed your first SQE1 or took it, or does it reset once you take SQE2?
Yeah, so that's quite right. The person who spotted this is quite right. We say candidates must get through all elements of SQE requirements within a 6-year period, and that period starts to run when you take your first attempt at SQE1, so it doesn't reset when you take SQE2. So time starts ticking when you do your first attempt at SQE1.
That's great. And perhaps another one for you, Julie. We've had, and you did cover this a bit, but it's probably worth reiterating. We've had a few questions in around data, and particularly publishing data around course providers, sort of pass results. And the type of questions we're getting there are, will you be publishing those results on your website? Who had the highest pass mark? And also, Ahmed said, he said some course providers aren't sharing their course results because they're saying that they can't at this point. What's the sort of general response, and just a reminder about what our approach is on course provider data?
Yeah, so the reminder is that we absolutely are committed to publishing this. We've said all the way through that we will publish pass rates by provider. We're not intending to have a league table, but what we will have is a tool where you'll be able to go into our website and call up a provider and see what their pass rate is. We're not doing it at the moment because of the risk that we've got a single data set. We know that the candidates who took SQE1 in November don't represent the full range of candidates who will be coming through in due course, so may or may not be representative. And if you think about it, each individual training provider's pass rates will be driven by two things: the candidates that they happen to be training and the quality of their training programs. And at this stage, you know, if a training provider says their pass rate is X, we don't know which of those is driving the overall pass rate. So it's much better for us to see over time what the patterns are and how training providers perform across different successive cohorts of people who they are training. So it's really important for candidates to think that, yes, pass rates are an important piece of information, but don't overinterpret it. There are lots of other things that it's important for you to bear in mind: the nature of the training, the cost of training, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's online, whether it's something that you can combine with working, all sorts of things for you to bear in mind. It's not just all about pass rates, particularly at this stage when we're at an early stage of the SQE.
I suppose, to pick up Ahmed's question, there's nothing to stop a training provider sharing their pass rates, but they have to be sure it's an accurate reflection of their candidates. They can't obviously misrepresent what their pass rate would be.
That's absolutely right, and that's important, and it's important for you when you're bearing in mind training provider pass rates to make sure you ask that question: is it accurate? Can you rely on it? But as I say, other things need to be borne in mind too.
And a follow-up question for you, Zoe. Somebody's asked about what feedback did candidates receive about if they passed or failed the SQE? Did they just find that out, or did they get tailored feedback on how they performed? So
a candidate will find out their score, the pass mark, and their quintile position. So they can see relatively how they performed. They don't get that detailed breakdown by the practice area. That's why we supply that overall for the assessment within the statistical report, so they can see there the particular areas that the cohort as a whole may have had difficulties with versus where people generally performed well.
Julie, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up that we've had a question from Bernadette that I don't think we have picked up, which Bernadette asked, is there a possibility that more answers are correct and that the best answer needs selecting? And I guess that's probably one for you, Zoe.
Yeah, so they are single best answer. So more than one might be correct, but, and this is an important point, one will be the most correct and clearly the preferred best option for a candidate that is performing at the standard of a day one solicitor.
I think that's right, isn't it? So there will only ever be one answer which is correct.
Yes.
So one answer, that one correct answer may be the best option to take, but that will in terms of the assessment always be the one correct answer. And we do check that the assessments work and the questions work in that way through our post assessment monitoring, which makes sure that, you know, we haven't inadvertently got two correct answers, that we haven't inadvertently got the wrong answer as the correct answer. All of that, as you can expect, is gone through really with a fine-tooth comb.
Absolutely.
And presumably that reflects legal practice, because it's not the case you come across a problem and there's one perfect answer and four absolutely
Exactly so.
terrible answers, but
Yeah.
there are shades, but there is one that is clearly the preferred option. So we've got just a minute or so left. I think we've managed to get through most of our questions. There is one just for you here, Julie. Somebody's asked, and this is your view from an employer point of view, and I suppose the answer maybe it depends. How important is getting a high mark on the SQE, or is it just about getting over the line and passing?
So the really important thing about this exam is that it is a competence test where there is a big difference between people who are competent, get over the line, and competent to practice, have demonstrated they've met the required minimum standard for practice, and those who don't. So that is overwhelmingly the most important thing. Obviously, that what that means is that we can go ahead and authorise you and admit you if you've met our other requirements as a solicitor. Some employers may want to look at actual marks, and that's one of the reasons why we have published and given you feedback by quintile, so to tell you where you are in your quintile, because pass marks vary from exam to exam. Being able to say, well, I was in the top quintile or the second quintile gives a comparison for employers over between candidates who've taken the SQE over successive sittings. So we are aware that candidates that employers may be interested in that, and that's why we gave that extra information to candidates. But the really important thing about this is, have you passed or have you not passed? That's where the license to practice comes from, and that should be everybody's core focus.
And I suppose one good thing is employers have an apples for apples comparison on the mark in a way they don't with perhaps the LPC, whereas
that's exactly
have a debate
right
with yourself as to whether one LPC is better than another potentially, which
that's exactly right. The consistency was always the key thing of SQE, and that's what the data is intended to give to employers.
Well, I think we're gonna. It's 1:30 now, and as I said, I state my reputation on finishing ahead of time, but I've failed on that. But at least let's try and finish on time. A big thank you to Zoe, to Jeff, and Julie for running through that. A big thank you to everyone who sent in questions. If you don't think your question has been picked up, you can get in touch with either Kaplan Customer Services, Candidate Services team, or with us at the SRA, but we will have a look at those questions, see whether there's any themes we think we need to cover. Also, a big thank you to Matt for all the production on this webinar, as well as Sarah Jane for filtering all the questions through. I wouldn't be a comms person or marketing person if I wasn't going to cross promote our other webinars. We've got 3 SQE webinars coming up, one on the training market, which I mentioned, one on qualifying work experience, and actually one on qualified lawyers and what it means for qualifying the SQE there. And we know there's a lot of queries and demand around that, so look out for them. But otherwise, the final thing I wanted to say is there is a feedback form below. It really, really helps us if you could click on that and take 1 minute just to say, did you find this useful? Was the chairing abysmal or brilliant? And was the content what was helpful? Because then we can take, if you do have constructive feedback, we can look to improve future webinars. But otherwise, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the morning, and I'm going to put my shoulder under a hot shower now. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.